That enlightenment, or that moment of the Enlightenment, which is most famous for its aspirations, its optimism, and its cult of human perfectibility and progress. And I want to examine that cult of progress by examining one essay written in 1784 by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment, who was in many ways a transitional figure between that high Enlightenment and the ensuing age of Romanticism. But first I want to begin by talking a bit about the High Enlightenment's conception of history. The High Enlightenment is characterized by an incredibly optimistic belief in the growth of human reason and the growth of human rationality. This cult held that not only was our knowledge of the world increasing, but as our knowledge increased, the world was changing with it. It was becoming a better world, a more humane world, a more rational world, a more progressive world. There was a sense that there had been, over the last 60 years before Kant's work, a continued improvement in human society, institutions, and moral character. There had been a growth of civility, culturation among all elements of society, a breakdown of feudal privilege, the ancien regime, a challenge to, at least a cursory challenge, to the status of women as second-class citizens, the liberation of minorities, and even the beginning of the anti-slavery movement in North America and in England. Kant wrote not long after the American Revolution, which was an event which further emboldened the mind of the High Enlightenment to believe that the age of despotism, of monarchy, of inequality, and of fundamental irrationality was coming to a close, and that a greater expansion of human freedom, of human potentialities, had begun and would continue. In fact, they believed the only hindrances to such development and such growth were superstition, were ignorance. That the only reason that society had ever failed to live up to the highest possible standards had been a lack of knowledge, ignorance, and priestly superstition, neither of which could extinguish the light of reason, which swept all historical relics before it. The philosophers of the High Enlightenment, and in France they were called philosophes, thought that progress would be unlimited, that improvement would be unchecked, and would result in human and social perfectibility. That as reason expanded, our institutions would become more and more humane, more and more universal, and ultimately perfect. And as those institutions changed and improved and progressed, similarly man's rational abilities would increase. We would become more educated, more humane, and morally superior characters than those who had preceded us. This was a widely held view, and I labored hard and long choosing a text. The most famous text is from Condorcet, who offered a universal scheme of human progress. And if there's time at the end of this lecture, I'll detail part of his scheme. But I chose Kant because it's in some ways more accessible. It's more accessible because it's less historical. There's less historical information in it, and because you're not historians, that means that there's less sort of rubbish or weight to get through, less obstacles to get through to the meat of the issue, the core. And also because it contains many of the elements that would emerge in subsequent romantic theories of history, the great philosophies of history of the 19th century. Kant's piece, a brief essay in this text called On History, takes the form of 9 theses, 9 principal statements or laws, which have been reproduced for you and were followed by explications and supporting arguments. And what I will do is present each of these theses, explain them, argue for them, and see what comes from them. I should point out, though, at the beginning that Kant sees as the end of history, the goal of history, the trend towards towards which it is developing, the growth of human reason in human culture and morality. He begins with an assumption, which is very much in keeping with the legacy of the early Enlightenment, that human behavior, like all behavior, is law-like, follows regular sequences of cause and effect, and that, in fact, these laws are universal and hold across time and space. It's his goal to first lay out what some of those laws are, what some of the mechanisms that moves history might be, and then suggest what its secular trend is. Once we've plotted where the forces have moved us, the next question is, where do they lead us next? Once we've made so much progress to where we are, where will progress lead us in the future? And that secular trend, that direction, that goal is very much the problem that Kant has posed for himself and attempts to answer in this essay. His first statement is that all natural capacities of a creature are destined to evolve completely to their natural end. Now, what does that mean? It means that every animal, every creature, every species has certain potentialities, certain possible lines of development. The acorn can become the oak tree. And that the system of nature is such that, as a whole, they will reach that end. That's the reason that they have the particular structure that they do. Now, this is obviously a frankly teleological view of nature, a view of nature which moves towards ends. And although it obviously does violence to the anti-Aristotelian, anti-teleological interpretations of the previous materialism, Kant nonetheless did feel that he was supported by the facts of biology. Indeed, if we think about biological entities, we do tend to think of them in terms of their ends, their functions, their purposes, what they develop towards. We do think that the human animal does have a natural course of development in its physical state, that if given proper nutrition and a proper environment, it will grow from infancy to the state of childhood to maturation, to that of a normal adult. So he sees in biology evidence of this view that things are destined to evolve completely to their natural ends. And in fact, he argues that without such a teleological interpretation of nature, as a regulating principle, as a fundamental structural law underlying the development of our species, history, as well as nature, would be aimless, would be disjointed, would be meaningless, would be anarchic, would be one damn thing after another. That without that teleological presupposition, we would have to agree with Henry Ford, history is bunk. It's only because we can believe that nature leads its various forms of life towards particular ends of development, that history has the possibility of taking on a meaningful and progressive developmental pattern. Well, his next thesis is that in man, those natural capacities which are directed to the use of his reason are to be fully developed only in the race, not in the individual. Again, starting with that first supposition that every species has all of its capacities developed to their end, is it possible that within one human lifestyle, one human person, I should say, one human lifespan, that person can develop all of their rational faculties to their complete end, can develop a complete and thorough rationality? And the answer is obviously no. The reason for this is that the growth of reason, as both a regulating principle over and against the instincts, and as a speculative principle, knows no essential limits. And that the human lifespan does have limits. There is a limit to how much we can know, to how much we can understand in one lifetime. But on the other hand, one can imagine within a culture a never-ending process of increasing civilization, civility, and cultural expansion, both in breadth, in depth, and comprehensiveness. So the shortness of the human lifespan precludes the complete evolution of this capacity capacity for reason and rationality demanded by the first thesis within the biological individual. It's therefore history, which is the field within the capacity of human reason, within which the capacity of human reason can reach its full and natural end. Obviously, this must occur within the species rather than the individual. And thus it is the species, rather than any particular culture, which is the central subject of history for Kant. Hence, Kant's use of the term cosmopolitan in the title of his essay, which is an idea for a universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view. The next thesis states that nature has willed that man should, by himself, produce everything that goes beyond the mechanical ordering of his animal existence, and that he should partake of no other happiness or perfection than that which he himself, independently of instinct, has created by his own reason. Now, that's a big sentence. Germans have a tendency to do that. What it means is basically that all higher or cultural development of mankind is only the result of his own activity, right? That there is no outside agency that gives us breakthroughs, developments. He's eliminating God from the pattern of human history. That is to say, the natural situation of the human species requires that it account for and create its own progress and elevation beyond the merely animal state. The point being, if we are to create for ourselves greater material satisfactions, we will have to create them, and we will have to create them through the deployment of our rational faculties. If we are to create more humane circumstances, societies, states, and civilizations, that will be as a result of our own activity and our rational forethought. This is important because Kant wants to argue strongly that the end of human history is not necessarily happiness, but the development of rationality. That happiness is, as it were, the bait that nature uses, that psychology uses to force us to develop our rational faculties, our scientific understanding, and our legal and jurisprudential wisdom. It is as if nature, as he states, and I quote, aimed more at his rational self-esteem than at his well-being. We are placed with challenges in the animal state with which we cannot contend unless we develop our rational faculties. And I think one gets a sense here of the exalted, almost overweening sense of pride that the high Enlightenment took in itself and in human capacity and potential. The notion of rational self-esteem, that we could take a pride in what we have accomplished and how far we have come and grown and developed and learned, is part of what was the excitement of one of the most exalted and inspiring moments in modern history. And another one of the implications of this thesis is that every generation, its happiness, is the result not of fortuitous circumstances, not of luck or of chance, but of the sacrifices and labors of previous generations. That we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, that we inherit from them the legacy of their rational contributions, as they will from us. And it is in that sense that there is still room to grow, that progress is always possible infinitely until we reach perfectibility, that spurs people on to greater and greater achievement and improvement. I want to turn to the next thesis. The means employed by nature to bring about the development of all the capacities of man is their antagonism in society, so far as this is, in the end, the cause of a lawful order among men. Another long German sentence. But Kant's argument here is in some ways similar to Adam Smith's arguments about the growth of national wealth. I want to use an analogy here very briefly. Smith argued that what leads people in business environments, what prompts them, is unadulterated greed. They want to make as much as they possibly can, and devil take the hindmost. So we begin with a very negative impulse, the impulse to acquire as much as possible at the expense of our fellow man. At the same time, if that greed is unfettered, self-interested, and allowed to express itself without the constraint of the state, it will result in, through the invisible hand of capitalism in the market, the growth of income for every member of society. So starting with a very negative motivation, we come out with the most positive result, the growth of the wealth of nations. And that's a sort of consequentialist argument. Well, Kant comes with a very similar argument here. It is in fact the fact that humans are fundamentally selfish and antagonistic, want to dominate one another and acquire as much as possible from our fellow human beings. We are naturally aggressive. That leads us to develop law, morality, statecraft, universal justice. So this universal human selfishness, which would destroy society and sociability, precisely because it threatens that, forces us to use our reason to develop these innovations. Systems of law, systems of courts, systems of police, systems of justice. So it's our urge to dominate that thus creates our need for humanity. It's our desire to be, and our innate proclivity to control one another that leads to the need for freedom and liberty from one another. These base passions, then, are thus the causes of our higher development, of our development towards more exalted goals. And this is something that Hegel would call the cunning of reason. Reason using the passions for its own advantage to produce greater rationality and progress. Okay. The next thesis states that the greatest problem for the human race is the solution of which nature drives man, to the solution of which nature drives man, is the achievement of a universal civic society which administers law among men. Now, the point is that only in society can the higher capacities of mankind be fully developed. Right? Living as Robinson Crusoe, when each man is his own poet, philosopher, and literary critic as well as scientist, the poetry, literary criticism, and science produced is likely to be quite laughable. It's only in the social context that our higher faculties, our rational faculties, achieve their greatest expression. And it's the freer the society, or the greater liberty within the society, that facilitates a greater development. The more free play each individual has within his society, the greater expression he will be able to make of his or her rational potential. Because one will have greater freedom of expression, a greater possibility for experiment and trial. Well, civil society, therefore, must allow for the mutual opposition of its members, because they are always going to be antagonistic. They're always going to be trying to profit from one another. And yet fix its limits, and I quote, so that it may be consistent with the freedom of others. This is the problem that nature poses to man in society, developing a society wherein we are given all of the liberty and freedom we know to express our unique capacities and develop them, and yet limit that so as not to impinge on the freedoms of others. And as we can see, this Kantian conception of balancing liberties and freedoms strongly informs our own constitutional tradition. The highest problem of history, then, is the development of the perfectly just constitution. A constitution which allows for order, stability, and yet the maximum amount of freedom possible without infringing on the freedom of others. This view was rampant throughout the High Enlightenment. One finds it particularly in North America, where for about 20 years, starting in about 1776, right through the federal Constitution, tome after tome after tome is written on how to create the ideal, the perfect Constitution, the perfect frame of government, whether we should mix the various elements of society in the government, should we separate powers, should there be a distinct judiciary, and finally, of course, that resulted in the frame of government which we now have, largely the result of Madison, Jefferson, and Adams. In such a society, one in which we have the maximum possible freedom combined with order in a perfectly just constitution, our competitive and aggressive urges, just as in Smith, result in excellence and in progress. Those aggressive urges, those competitive urges are sublated, are placed in the form of attempting to achieve adulation by producing excellence, by producing progress, through mechanical invention, through poetic innovation, through scientific revolution. I want to read to you briefly a quote from Kant, which exemplifies what he sees as this process in an analogy. It is just the same with trees in a forest. Each needs the others, since each in seeking to take the air and sunlight from others must strive upward. And thereby, each realizes a beautiful, straight stature, while those that live in isolated freedom put out branches at random and grow stunted, crooked, and twisted. And this is a wonderful metaphor or analogy for the process he has in mind. If there is no constraint, if there is no competition for resources among trees, there is no reason for them to grow in an erect fashion, because there's plenty of sunlight. It's only when they must compete, when there are trees around them and undergrowth, that they have to grow straight so that they can be as tall as possible and get the maximum amount of sunlight for photosynthesis. The next thesis states that this problem is the most difficult and the last to be solved by mankind. Now, part of the problem, as Kant sees it, is the selfish nature of man, which makes it highly likely that any government we could create, any perfect constitution, any magistracy, once created, will abuse its power. Kant, for all his optimism, is acutely aware that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he's aware that this is the greatest obstacle we must overcome, that antagonistic nature which in fact leads to our own progress. That somehow or other there must be some possibility of surmounting that, because one cannot trust a magistrate with authority if unchecked. And that's part of the reason why we need to develop governments of law and not of men. Well, Kant sees three essential requirements for the solution of this problem in history. The first is a correct conception of a possible commonwealth. What this requires is political scientific research, and perhaps a ransacking of the histories of previous peoples. How have mixed governments worked? What have been the results of them? Of the British Parliament, of the French Parliament, of the Diet in Poland? How have separation of powers worked in various places? And again, he's drawing on a rich tradition of such speculation, people like Montesquieu and Vico and Hume and Pufendorf and Grotius. And that, he thinks, is one of the essential requirements, that theoretical research into political science and social science, it gives us an understanding of what will work under what circumstances and what is the best form of government, the best frame, the best mixture of powers, institutions, and elements of the society and social structure. The next requirement is practical knowledge, not theoretical knowledge, but a practical knowledge from experience, from trial and error. Okay, we think that a mixed government, which brings in the various elements of society, is the best. Let's look at 4 examples of them. How have they worked? When they have worked, what's caused them to work? When they haven't, what stood in their way? It also means trial and error in our own cases. So, to draw an example off the top of my head, the government of Pennsylvania during the Revolution came to the conclusion that the best form of government was the most democratic form of government. And they instituted a unicameral assembly. Unicameral assembly means that basically there is only one body of the legislature, it has all the power, and the governor in Pennsylvania was almost powerless. That was an example of trial and error, the most democratic system of government. It didn't work. They eventually repealed it and replaced it with a bicameral system with a much more powerful governor. So this is one of the requirements. We have to be willing to experiment, to try, and to experiment scientifically, right? Not just putsches and coups and coup d'etats, but more importantly, to be able to rationally say, let's try a unicameral scheme. If it doesn't work, we can change it. And again, this is not unique to Kant. If you think about our frame of government, the provision that allows for amendment to the Constitution clearly is designed with just that realization in mind. Some of the provisions we have now may not work. Let's try them. Let's see. If they don't work, there's a mechanism that if we've scientifically measured that they haven't worked in experience, in trial and error, we can change them. We can add new elements. The very existence of our Constitution is an example. We did have a Constitution before that. There was Articles of Confederation. They tried it. Didn't work. Back to the drawing board and progress. And that's, of course, where history becomes a practical science for Kant. It's there in the past that we can find examples of trial and error, as well as in our present and future. And finally, the third requirement is, and I quote, a good will ready to accept such a constitution. That means not only a conceptual understanding of what will work and a practical awareness of what has worked, but the desire, the goal, and the disinterested patriotism and civic-mindedness of the society to put such a thing in place and to live according to its dictates. And as we'll see, there was just such a moment for us with the founding of our nation and the founding of our Constitution. No sooner had it been established than people on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line accused each other of not having that goodwill ready to accept such a Constitution. The result was the most bloody carnage in American history, the American Civil War, following after 40 years of internal division in politics. Kant is not naive about this. I mean, he's almost prophetic. He is aware that this is not an easy project. People will always try to place their self-interest above that goodwill towards the perfect civic constitution. And it's for that reason that he's acutely aware this project may take quite a while. Humans may have to learn the error of self-interested action through many, many failures and disappointments. Okay. I want to turn to the next thesis now. In many ways, the last and most challenging, actually second to last. The problem of establishing a perfect civic constitution, the ideal government, is dependent upon the problem of lawful external relations among states and cannot be solved without a solution of the latter problem. Hence, a return to his cosmopolitanism. Consider, it was asocial antagonisms that produced the need for society in the first place. Asocial antagonisms among individuals. The same relation we find among individuals relative to the society could be found among states relative to the international order, where we conceived of individuals put in the place of governments, nations. So the same needs that created lawful civic justice among men can be seen in the relationship between nation-states. Now, the equivalent of a lawful civil society among individuals for states is obviously a global nation or a global League of Nations. Kant, again, was visionary here, and this is part of the cosmopolitan charm of the Enlightenment. Kant actually worked up a plan for a League of Nations, for United Nations. It was about 14 points, and guess who read it? Woodrow Wilson. That was where the League of Nations came from. He included in it provisions, self-determination of people, democratic republics, freedom of the seas, all of the principles that we think now inform our best hopes for international order date at this moment. And Kant sees that we cannot solve the problem of a civic constitution for each individual state until there is a global order. And he's quite right. Because if there is not a global order, you may have the perfect civic constitution and you may be quickly overrun by other nations and find that constitution destroyed. And I quote here, in a League of Nations, his phrase that Wilson coined, in a League of Nations, or Wilson used, even the smallest state could expect security and justice not from its own power and by its own decrees, but only from this great league of nations, from a united power, acting according to decision, reached under the laws of the united will. If you think about it, that wonderfully could be used if you take out the word League of Nations and put in the word civic society, take out the nations and put in individuals. That characterizes the way our society does in fact function, where even the weakest and smallest has a say and has power not because of his own personal or her own personal abilities, but because of the universal liberation of all, to extend rights to all, independent of one's wealth or social status. Well, the same could be seen for the international order. We need, as it were, an international republic. And Kant argues that as utopian as this may seem, there are already historical dynamics leading it to occur. Each war undermines the international order. It weakens it. And just as social struggles weaken the existing order of the civil state, of our government, just as internal dissensions undermine our nation, until it reaches a state of stability, the same thing will occur in the relations among nations. That as disorders occur, as wars occur, there is a natural tendency among the nations, just as there are among the individuals, to try to establish a new order, a more stable structure, to try and learn from the mistakes of the last generation. In fact, Kant argues any sort of moral order is impossible. Truly moral order is impossible until this institution is created, the Global League of Nations. And part of the reason for this is, if one considers the vast resources that every society must, simply to protect itself, waste on militarism, one realizes that those same resources could be used for scientific research, for education, for cultural improvement, for public health, for free schooling, for general social uplift and improvement. And so one can't have a truly moral society until we are able to take those resources and cease to channel them into unproductive lines and place them into paths which will lead to progress and to development. Okay, next thesis. The history of mankind can be seen, in the large, as the realization of nature's secret plan to bring forth a perfectly constituted state, as the only condition in which the capacities of mankind can be fully developed, and also bring forth that external relation among states which is perfectly adequate to this end. Okay. Kant's argument is that the present competition and antagonism between states gives us reason to believe that his course of development towards a universal cosmopolitan League of Nations and perfectly just civic constitutions is in fact possible and likely. Well, consider why. In the relation of states he found, and I think it still obtains today, the competition among states requires that each government, if it is self-interested and follows its self-interest, and that sort of Smithian analogy again, must attempt to foster cultural development. Because it's a cultural development that leads to innovation, technical breakthroughs and scientific breakthroughs, which even from a militaristic standpoint reap enormous dividends. So every state has to try and foster its cultural development just so that it can keep up with its competitors and with its neighbors. And thus, the self-interest of rulers results in the promotion of greater and greater enlightenment. Now, I've mentioned cultural development. Similarly, Kant notes commercial development, the growth of the wealth of nations, is an important principle and means of power by which a government is able to sustain itself, even with the worst motivations, purely militaristic motivations. The government requires revenue to be able to fund its military. It can only get that revenue from taxes on commerce. If it taxes property, at least in the 18th century, you'd have gotten a revolution. As Americans noticed, we've changed a bit since then. But the notion is, if you don't constantly foster commercial development, so that you can have excise taxes and the greater wealth of nations, you fall behind your neighbors and aren't able to protect yourself. Well, at the same time, you cannot have commercial development in an authoritarian structure. People only take risks when they know that they are certain to at least have the possibility of reaping rewards. There must be a certain amount of freedom. Freedom of trade, freedom of expression, to be able to foster commercial development. And that, of course, itself turns out to be a great source of power for rulers. So even with the worst motivations, following their self-interest, civil freedom cannot be infringed without jeopardizing commerce, which is a great source of power for states and their rulers. Freedom thus spreads by degrees. Again, I quote, "Limitations of personal actions are step by step removed, and general religious freedom is permitted." I want to pause. That's important because religious freedom comes from merchants from different nations. If you don't have religious freedom, they can't come to your city and establish merchant houses, and you're going to have no commerce. Something that had not happened in the 17th century except in England, and then does develop. I return to the quote, "Enlightenment comes gradually with intermittent folly and caprice. As a great good which must finally save men from the selfish aggrandizement of their master, always assuming that the latter know their own interest." So that master being the rulers, the states, the despots, as long as they know where their bread is buttered, as long as they know their own self-interest and pursue it, will always result in a greater expansion of human freedom and human liberty. In fact, the international nature of commerce, which had emerged by the late 18th century and certainly exists in our present global economy, means that every nation and all states have an interest in seeing all civil disturbances and revolutions arbitrated peacefully, simply because a revolution disrupts the flow of commerce, may lead to the loss of property, perhaps even the seizure and nationalization of property. And this means and lays the way for an international order that will attempt to arbitrate such disputes. And in fact, that is occurring. Kant has been prophetic in many ways. When struggles occur around the world, revolutions and civil wars, the international community almost always tries to arbitrate the difference. And not necessarily from humanitarian principles, from self-interested principles. It's good for trade. It's good for international stability. It's bad for every nation if another nation undergoes disruptive revolutions. It's a cause for concern. Finally, the last thesis. A philosophical attempt to work out a universal history according to a natural plan directed to achieving the civic union of the human race must be regarded as possible, and indeed as contributing to this end of nature. Which is to say, two bits. First, it must be possible to come up with this conception, with this model, which he thinks he has in these 9 theses. That is because if it is rational and real, it must be comprehensible. It must be scientifically capable of analysis and exposition. The second point is that it will actually contribute to the development of this state of affairs. Simply by becoming aware of such a work as Kant's inspires us, urges us, causes us to reflect on the nature of our institutions, both nationally and internationally, points out a possible line of action, a way of resolving, perhaps, the disorders within our own society and within the international community. In fact, a study of constitutions from ancient Greece through Rome to the present, for Kant, shows a continuous progress in Europe. Each constitution is more humane than the one that follows it. And a realization of that, and a being aware of that, and exposing of that, makes us jealous to guard that progress, to make sure that it doesn't backslide. It's just that awareness, exposition of these principles, which leads people to refuse to allow their masters to act in a way which limits their freedom. And again, to draw right off the top of my head an analogy, one of the interesting things when the Iron Curtain fell down a few years ago that surprised a lot of people in the United States, myself included, was how profoundly peoples there depended on Radio Free Europe and the transmission of our, quote, propaganda over there. That was an incredibly inspiring source to them. It gave them a potential vision of another way that their world and our world could be. Now, this development within Europe of increasing constitutionality, of increasing legality, the breakdown of despotism, followed by the breakdown of feudal privilege, the growth of civic equality. Kant thinks will continue to develop. We know from other Enlightenment thinkers like Wollstonecraft, there were other things to be done, right? There was a vindication of the rights of women to come, a vindication of the rights of ethnic and racial minorities. Kant thought from Europe, we would bring that law, that progress, to the rest of the world. Europe would be the beacon to the rest of the globe, bringing to it constitutional republics, civil society based on law, liberty, and freedom, and international order. Such a progressive view of history offers us, beyond a law-like comprehension of the past, a comforting prospect for the future. It gives us a reason to believe that the future may, in fact, be even better than the present. It gives us a reason to aspire, to feel confident about what may follow us, what will be the lot of our children and grandchildren. And that is something about which we cannot be indifferent. We cannot help but care profoundly about the legacy that we will leave to those that follow us. And it is also not only something that we are concerned about for the future, but it is a consolation for our own present. It gives us a certain sense of satisfaction to know that we've done our job well, that we have helped history move forward. It also, quite obviously, offers a plan of action. What do we need to do next? Once we have this sense of where we've been, where we're going, where history ends up, we know what the next steps are. We know what the next plans are. And it also gives us a spur to action. It gives us a motive, a strong motive. Now, I want to conclude and summarize in not only a laudatory but perhaps critical way as well, a few comments about the Enlightenment, the High Enlightenment's optimistic belief in unlimited progress. First of all, that faith required a very selective view of history, right? To believe that history is one story of constant progress, from ancient Rome to late 18th century Europe, means that you have to kind of turn a blind eye to the hideous religious wars of the 17th century, where the rivers of the German Palatine were red with blood. I mean, just incredible carnage. It also meant you had to ignore Dark Ages. Progress from the Rome to the Enlightenment had to sort of skip out of that period that Vico called the Second Barbarism, the period when, after Rome was overrun, when universities were abolished everywhere in Europe, and where literacy declined, and where people returned to a much more primitive, almost Neolithic village life. It also did violence to our understanding of the past. By seeing things in purely progressive terms, anything that didn't fit that progressive scheme, like, say, medieval Europe, was dismissed as superstition, as nonsense, as the rule of priests, the rule of madmen and gibberish. And that meant that we could never understand sympathetically what the mentality or culture of that epoch really was. And the result is that the High Enlightenment produced no histories of medieval Europe. They did histories of Greece and Rome. Gibbon did perhaps the classic exposition of Rome. And then after that, history picks up with the Renaissance. And it jumps right ahead through the Renaissance to the Age of Reason. So huge chunks of history just sort of get lost because they don't really fit the scheme. Now, as bad as that is for our understanding of the past, and as an historian that concerns me greatly, it may in fact have even been worse for our understanding of the future. It made us incredibly short-sighted. Nothing dramatizes this more than the event to which Kant attached almost cosmic significance, the French Revolution. I would argue that the French Revolution produced every bit as much terror as it did enlightenment. Its fighting for the rights of man came at the price of at the price and by the means of the guillotine. And the terror, both red and white, that followed were absolutely horrific. And that sort of short-sightedness about the potential for breakdown, for disaster, was what I would call the blind side of the Enlightenment's cult of progress. In fact, again, to turn to the French Revolution, what did it result in finally, this fighting for the rights of man? But the creation of Napoleon's empire and its reactionary aftermath on the hands of Metternich and Talleyrand. And it contributed to those things far more than it contributed to any growth in the rights of man. Okay? Having said so much in terms of criticism, nonetheless, I want to be fair and acknowledge the Enlightenment's cult of progress has remained an important legacy for us today. It's one that has inspired many progressive movements. And in fact, the name progressive movements comes from that moment. It's inspired many revolutionary movements, radical movements, movements that have, in fact, expanded human freedom. And things like the League of Nations, things like civil rights, goals of human equality and humanity. And it's that legacy which the High Enlightenment has left us with which is what we have today to grapple with.